Hello, and welcome to Week 4 of the Introduction 2020 Faculty Perspective Series. We've designed these programs to allow you to see the tremendous depth and breadth of academic and research interests amongst our faculty and preview many of the exciting things you can study here at the University of Oregon. Over the course of this summer, we are presenting faculty perspectives in 5 separate tracks that highlight the interdisciplinary nature of big questions. In our 5 programs today, we feature the School of Law, 2 departments within the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Lundquist College of Business. As a reminder to you students who are watching, be sure you complete your reflection on this program after we're done by visiting community.uoregon.edu. Additionally, the last 15 minutes of this session will be dedicated to answering your questions live on camera. In Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions of your presenter today. Today's faculty perspectives in the anti-racism track will explore what we mean when we talk about freedom. I'm pleased to welcome Professor of Law Michelle McKinley. Welcome, Professor McKinley.
Thank you very much, Cora. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to our conversation today. As Cora mentioned, I teach in the law school's undergraduate legal studies program. I teach a course on immigration and citizenship. And what the course basically does at a 200 level undergraduate course is that we talk about how citizenship is a legal construct, who can come to this country because it's based in the United States, who can't come, who's eligible to come, and so we teach that from a legal perspective, and then from a social perspective, we talk about how we create community and those constituencies of belonging. And so that's just a little plug for my class that I teach in the fall. But today, I actually wanted to talk to you about my research that I have spent, over 2 decades looking at. And so my question to you is, as you think through your reflection, is I want you to jot down, without too much thought, what do we mean when we talk about freedom? Like, what does freedom mean to you? A lot of people think that freedom is the absence of any kind of constraint over their bodies, or over their movement, or over their speech. And so if that's in your reflection, that's great. But I want to see what we mean when we talk about freedom today, because I'm a historian of slavery. And so if you put in your reflection that freedom is the absence or the antithesis of bondage, then you get extra points. But let's start, because I have a concept not about freedom, but I have a concept that's called fractional freedom. So you have slavery on one side, freedom on the other, and then you have fractional freedom in the middle. So I have thought a lot about freedom, but really in the context of slavery and bondage. And I've wondered what it means to claim freedom as a woman who is enslaved for herself and for her family. When I'm at a dinner party and people ask me what I do, I tell them that I'm a historian of slavery. And that's generally guaranteed to be a conversation killer, as the topic of slavery makes people very uncomfortable or feel at a loss for small talk. Remember, the context is a dinner party. So they sort of look around awkwardly for a segue, or they try to, because there's nothing really funny that they can say in response, or if they did, it might be inappropriate. So they try to figure out how to move on to a lighter topic appropriate to a dinner party, and I tell them a story. And the story often sometimes goes like this. So we know that 12 million people left the African continent for the New World as part of the slave trade. I really just invite you to look at the currents and the maps and the numbers. Many of those people did not survive the Middle Passage. About 2 million of those 12 million souls did not survive the Middle Passage. However, of those 10 million people, less than 500,000 came to the United States. That's only 5%. So 500,000 people came in bondage to the United States. So what about the other 9.5 million? What we know about slavery in the New World, and I would encourage you to think about this as you listen to this presentation, what do you know about slavery outside of the United States? Look at the map. What we know about slavery in the New World is vastly disproportionate to the totality of the experience of African slaves in the Americas. The brunt of the scholarly conversation, the films, the novels, the full force of the abolitionist movement is weighted heavily towards the United States. But what about the other 9.5 million women? What were their lives like? Where did they go? And what was it like to claim freedom for them? So as a legal historian of slavery, I work a lot with legal codes. I won't go into the intricate details about the legal culture of 16th century Spanish America, but I do want to highlight a few things that are important to my story. So on the first line, you'll see that slaves had legal personality. What that really means is that they had the ability to sue in court. And when they sued for a number of reasons, but most of the things that I was able to research was enslaved people suing to purchase their own freedom. Slaves were able to marry, and their marriages were legally recognized by their owners, and they had to be.
Professor McKinley, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're having some technical difficulties. So we're going to take a real quick pause.
Sure.
I'm sorry to do this.
No, that's fine.
And fix the problem that we're having with the captioning in YouTube and Facebook. And
Okay.
We'll take one quick pause.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So are we going to pick up from here?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sure.
Thank you for your patience. In an effort to make sure that our programs are accessible to all, we wanted to make sure that we had our captions live. I will turn things back over to you, Professor McKinley. Take it away.
Great, thank you. I think it's obviously very important to get all of this right, and I appreciate everybody working so hard to make sure that this is accessible. So before the cut, we were talking about the civil law of slavery, and I was saying that as a legal historian, I spend a lot of time with codes. So there are 5 things that I want to make sure that you understand about the civil law, not the common law, because the United States, of course, is a common law, but the civil law of slavery. And one was that slaves had legal personality, which meant that they had the ability to sue in court. Enslaved people could also purchase their own freedom, which is very, very important. This is not a legal provision that was honored in the United States. Certainly their marriages were, they had the right to legally marry, and their owners had to respect their marriages, which means that they could not be split up, that they had conjugal rights, and that they could not be sold and be apart as a family. They had the ability to own property, which was very important. They could earn their own wages, which they often used to purchase their own freedom, freedom of their family members, and they also used it to buy property. So in sum, the takeaway is that the civil law created many more paths to freedom. And in my research, what I have seen is that about 75% of enslaved women throughout the Americas purchased their own freedom, and that of their family members. And one of the reasons that women were particularly keen on purchasing their own freedom or the freedom of their mothers was that they would not inherit the condition of slavery, right? So that's an important point which I wanted to take home. I work in Peru, and I can't physically take you to Peru today, and I know that a lot of you are in many different places and not in Eugene, but I'm going to take you to Peru right now, visually. Many of you might not think about Africans in relation to Peru. When I say Peru to you, you might think of Machu Picchu and the magnificent terrain of the Andean Cordillera. These might be the faces that you associate with Peru. But it might surprise you to know that in the 1600s, Lima was a predominantly black city. The city's grand and ornate cathedrals, palaces, monasteries, gardens were all built by enslaved labor. When I first started to think about doing research in the archives, I have to say there's a lot of pictures here about convents and monasteries. It's because I do a lot of work on nuns, but I won't talk to you about that today. When I first started but I do love this picture, I have to share it with you. When I first started to think about doing research in the archives, I read a case by a young woman who was called Juana De Godinez. Juana went to court to file a complaint against her master, and she asked for a new owner by filing a petition. She alleged that her owner was lustful and withheld her wages. In her petition, she asked to be placed in a new position that allowed her 2 hours a day to attend to her litigation, which she claimed was the customary amount of time that it took to deal with her legal affairs. Now, there's a lot here within this complaint that's titillating and scandalous. Her owner was a highly ranked priest, and here she was outing him to his peers and superiors and disclosing their illegitimate children. But it was the assurance with which she claimed that she would need 2 hours a day to attend to her litigation, which really caught my attention. And it was the expectation that this would be respected that I found particularly interesting and exciting. Nowhere in the United States could I have found a petition like this. So I began looking deeper and deeper, and over the course of 10 years, I found many, many women like Juana. I was dragged into the daily dramas and life stories full of passion and the messiness of interpersonal relationships as people like Juana negotiated fractions of freedom in their lives in bondage. So where do I find these stories? Where do I find these legal dramas? These treasured finds are the result of painstaking research through these old and crumbling folios. It is the promise of finding something new and exciting that describes what historians call the allure of the archive. So I'm going to take you into the archive, as well as taking you to Peru. This is the standard cast of characters of colonial history. They're men who conquer new territories for king and queen. They're men who wage wars and rebellions, men who birth new nations and write constitutions. But these are the subjects of my books. My subjects work in the domestic slaveholding household. And I approach the household as a very dense and crowded, raucous political site. It's a place of chamber pots and dirty linen and every single body fluid that you could imagine. It is a place of tension and joy and envy and desire, confrontation, aggression, sadness, and grief. This is a household that is not usually thought of as a political space, but I think about it as a highly charged political space. I look at this place not just as a stereotypical upstairs, downstairs, but as a fluid space of politics and relationships where race, sex, gender, generation, status, and condition are all worked out. And in my work, what I try to do is unpack these easy conflations of law and justice, law and its magisterial claims to justice, and unpack relationships like master-slave, history as this triumphal march to modernity, and really think about how all these things work together. And my point is that these relationships of labor are thick. They are bonds that are forged not just of labor, intimate labor, but also of godparenthood, of apprenticeship, of money lending, of landlords, cooks, witness, and testator. So let me give you the outlines of another great story. There's a lot of detail here, and I won't get you terribly drawn into names and things. I'm just going to say boy meets girl, boy on the left meets girl on the right, and falls madly in love. He asks her mother for her daughter's hand in marriage. The problem is that the beautiful girl on the right is a slave of a wealthy and formidable owner called Doña Beatriz. The mother goes straight away to Beatriz and puts the wedding proposal before her. The fact that a Spaniard of noble birth wants to marry Maria should have been a good proposition, and it should have pleased both her mother and her owner. But Beatriz opposed the marriage, saying that it was not yet time. So the couple do what they always do. They get married in secret. So I want to fast forward to the beginning. This case took place in 1682, and I found it in 2014. I find the document when a disconsolate boy, Pedro, comes to the court to seek an annulment of his marriage on the basis of fraud, a legal ground of fraud. The court could not believe that Pedro would not have found out or discerned Maria's true status. Maria, for her part, when she was asked why she didn't just tell her suitor that she was a slave, she just said he never asked. So kudos to her, because he never asked. Now, the question raised by this case is not whether Pedro's sort of dealing with a full deck. Pedro is the guy on the left. He obviously was a bit dim. Or whether the community covered up for Maria. What's more interesting to me is that Juana, the mother, Beatrice's former slave, and Maria's mother, was still very much in Beatrice's life. Despite their relationship as human property, they prayed together every day, and they ate together every day. They were at each other's bedsides. When Beatriz died, and she ultimately died not as a result of this case, but I found her later, she died at home, surrounded by her loved ones, including Maria, her family, and her confessors. So Juana didn't just say, you know, I'll see you later when she got her freedom. She remained very much in Beatrice's life. Two of her other daughters remained in Beatrice's custody. My point here is that early modern worlds, like you see in the 1600s, were deeply and intimately intertwined. There were no free agents wielding their individualism and their autonomy in the early modern world. People's survival depended on their position within multi-generational dependencies, and those dependencies grew out of the drudgery of care work in a household that came with the expectation of a reward of freedom that had legal purchase in court. And when I mean legal purchase, I mean it as a way of saying that these were arguments that could be recognized by judges and validated. And so my goal has been to focus on the power of these relationships, the power dynamic between these women and among these women, that tends to be relegated to the sideline as mere sentiment. None of this suggests that this was easy. None of this suggests that this was not arduous work. It does suggest that in order to understand slavery, we have to understand and think about what freedom looked like, what fractional freedom looked like, and how it was lived. So before you heard this, if I asked you what you thought freedom meant, this should be in your chat, you might have an answer that was probably not philosophically thought out or sophisticated, but you might generally say it's, you know, control, autonomy over your time, the ability to do what you want, when you want to do it, and where you want to do it. And if I asked you what you thought about slavery, you might have given me the opposite. You might have an idea about it, but it would be the lack or the absence of autonomy. But my goal here has been to complicate these questions and categories, and to encourage you to think about life beyond the label. Anna, in the first vignette, claimed the wages that she was earned, fought for her dignity, and claimed the right to her children, even though she was just property under the law. What I want to do here is to complicate the way that you think about freedom, and in particular, fractional freedom. Most of all, I want to step away from the label of the condition of slavery to represent the totality of the existence that millions of people lived. And they lived their lives in bondage. And I want to reiterate that for the majority of people, this is where they lived their lives, between slavery and freedom, in that middle ground that I am calling fractional freedom. That these were freedoms that were accrued over time, that these were freedoms that were hard won, but that they were not at either extreme. of freedom or slavery. They were fractions of them. So, thank you for listening. And now I think we're back to Cora.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much. We do have several minutes for questions, so I want to make sure that we get to those. And I've been watching here on my phone to the questions that are coming in. Sophia has a question for you. And Sophia wants to know, did slaves who were able to sue often win? And what was the court system like? i.e., was there a jury or no? Or how did the court system work for slaves that were able to sue?
Thank you so much for that question, Sophia. That's a great question. So in the civil law, there's no jury. It's very different to the common law. Whoever was in a litigant going to court would present their evidence through their advocate, whether it was a public defender or a prosecutor, and they would then submit all of this before a judge who would preside over the case and render a ruling. The question of winning as opposed to losing is really important. And I look at this as a very, very long, drawn-out process in which people don't actually win or lose. They are able to make claims, and they're able to make those claims visible. Sometimes the court acted, or the act of going to court just was a prompt to make sure that either owners knew that there were more powerful people that were watching them, that were safeguarding the rights of the vulnerable people that they sought to exploit. So it's not actually a question of winning or losing, it's advancing and sometimes winning, small victories, individual accrued victories over time.
Thank you. So another question that came in, why do you think there was such a contrast between the treatment of slaves in North America versus South America?
So there have been, I want to say, 400 or 500 monographs that address that question. One is, one is that what I showed you in the slide on the civil law of slavery comes from the Justinian Code. It comes from, the Roman law of slavery that really does rule the civil law, the civil law. But it also developed over centuries in Europe. And so there was a real impetus to create pathways to freedom that was part of the civil law. So when I look at a tome like the Civil Law of Slavery that was written, and compiled, what you will see is a very small entry, because really the way that people could be enslaved in the ancient world and in the early modern world was through war. And so the law of war is highly regulated. The way that people can be freed is so much more complex, and there was so much more detail that was, so you could be freed for, service to the king or service to the, what I'm saying is that there were a lot more off-ramps that were built into the civil law than in the common law. The United States gets into the slave trade at a time in which planters are extremely concerned about keeping people enslaved. They need that labor. So they foreclose any opportunity, almost every opportunity, that could have been available to enslaved people to accrue their freedom.
Thank you. Madison wants to know, this sounds like you've intrigued Madison. Are there any classes that we can take with this professor as a freshman?
Well, thank you, Madison. There's as I said in the beginning, I teach a class on immigration and citizenship. And I teach that in the fall to undergrads.
Fantastic. And so for Madison and others who are listening, remember to complete that advising module and your reflections for these to stay on track to be ready for your advising appointment, and make sure that you talk with your academic advisor about your interest in taking a class from Professor McKinley. Yasmin wants to know, how do you think casual racism seen today can be addressed and eliminated?
Sorry, Cora, can you repeat that? I'm having a little difficulty hearing you.
Yes. So Yasmin wants to know, how do you think casual racism seen today can be addressed or eliminated?
So I don't know what you mean by casual racism. So I might have to ask I don't know what that term means.
Yeah.
It's a little beyond me. So tell me, could you ask her to
Oh, okay,
say
I'm
what
sorry.
it is?
Let me, not casual, causal.
Causal.
Causal, yes. So
Okay.
there was clarification. That's a reading error on my part. How do you think causal racism seen today can be addressed and eliminated? Sorry, Yasmin.
Well, I mean, that takes some thought. Illuminated would mean to expose. But I think that we're beyond just exposing racist structures, and we have to figure out ways in which to dismantle them and to rebuild them. So causal racism, in terms of cause and effect, it's really important to highlight and to expose and to shame. I think that's important. But it's also important to have something that's much more proactive. What is it that we're going to use in place? What is it that we're going to build? What is it that we're going to strive to and aspire to build? That would be my initial response to a really complex question. And I'm thankful for it. I want to hear more, maybe from Yasmin, about ideas that she thinks are important. But I do think it's important to expose so that we can rebuild.
Thank you. Okay, so can you tell us other examples of fractional freedom?
Outside of the two confines of slavery and bondage and freedom, I think that it's a very pragmatic approach to two extremes. Mm-hmm. It's hard to make compromise and accretion exciting and sexy. People want, one of the things that I do when I talk about my work is to convince folks that winning, in court is actually a huge achievement. But people want plantations burned down, they want masters stabbed in their beds, they want, the mistress's coffee poisoned, and those are the things that you see in the movies. Mm-hmm. People didn't actually live their lives like that. There were real consequences for violence against slaveholders. And so, but if I were to take this outside of the context of slavery and maybe look at other working conditions, I think that that old saying about the arc that bends towards justice, that is fractional freedom. It's a result of compromise and fighting. You might not win everything that you want by 5 o'clock today, but if you get one thing done by 5 o'clock today that moves you closer to your goal of liberation and abolition, then that's a fractional freedom right there.
Thank you. Talia wants to know, could you elaborate on the difference between civil and common law? Do you see certain aspects of one system being more likely to advance justice than the other?
So the difference between civil law and common law is that the civil law is ruled by codes. So the civil code of slavery is not like a black code or a slave code in the United States. It is a huge compendious thing that takes centuries to draw up. So if I were to look at, say, a family code or a property code or something like that, these live on for the young codes live on for 300 years. The enduring codes live on for 800, 900 years, the ones that are not touched. And so that's one of the other questions before asked about juries. So there are no juries in the civil law. It is up to the judge to render an interpretation based on the code. In the common law, you have precedent. And what precedent means is that if a case has similar facts that's decided in a similar jurisdiction, so let's say Oregon, the judge and the jury are bound by the precedent that was handed down in a similar case with similar facts in this jurisdiction. That's what it means. And so both of the one is case law and one is a civil code. The second part of the question, Cora, can you repeat it for me?
Yes, absolutely. So the question from Talia, the second part was whether or not one of those has a better chance of advancing justice than the other.
I don't think so. And that's a great question. And I just, I can point to a lot of celebrated cases. For instance, the Somerset case was a big celebrated case in England in the 1800s that established England's free soil principle. So Somerset was an enslaved man who was from Barbados and came into London in service of his master, and appealed to the court. And in a very famous opinion, Lord Mansfield said that England had no place for slavery. It was free soil, so that once slaves got to England, the same principle applied in France, right? France itself was about franchise and freedom. So those were great pronouncements for plaintiffs who were in that position, who were in Europe and could claim free soil. But I don't think that was necessarily a reflection that the common law was better or more favorable to enslaved litigants than the civil law, for sure.
Thank you. Okay, so we want to make sure that we get to another question. Ari wants to know, because of the difference in slavery in the Americas, would that have an impact in the civil rights movement in North America during the 20th century and the current BLM movement happening now?
Thank you so much. So was that Ari?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Ari. I think that there are two things that we can, that's a complex question. I'm just going to boil it down to some of my thoughts, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. One is that you have to imagine the impact of race on slavery, and the other part that you have to imagine is the impact of citizenship for formerly enslaved people. And so I'm just going to talk about, for instance, Latin America, that I know the most, and the United States second, where I live. One thing that changes the dynamic of society for Black people and societal mobility, social mobility, is the presence of a very, very large community of free Black people, right? So it looks very different. The ratio looks very different when the folks who are enslaved are in the majority, or the folks who are enslaved cannot become free. The cases that I describe are cases in which people do achieve, fractions of freedom, but they're also able to own property, they're also able to marry, they're also able to pursue paths that will take them into communities of very, very large communities of color who are free. That makes a big difference for citizenship. I think in the United States, what you have is a real tie of race to slavery, right? At the time that the United States becomes a slave society, there is a huge push to tie race to civilization, to the ability to become a citizen. Race determines who can vote, who can own property, not just slavery, right? So I think those are the two main features that are somewhat distinctive in the cases that I'm talking about. Today's BLM movement is today's BLM movement that is a unique movement in the United States that has global outreach and global impact. But it would be wrong in the same way that people are trying to expropriate and appropriate the Black Lives Matter movement to sort of, call attention to other grievances. It would be wrong to appropriate that movement. There are lots of people who are in solidarity all across the globe, but the BLM movement started here, and it started in response, or it grew out of a response to certain frustrations that are really frustrations that we have to deal with at a community level, at a national level, before thinking about taking this global. And I know, because I'm in conversations with lots of activists worldwide, and the closest approximation of the BLM movement that I have seen is in Brazil, because of the very, very similar techniques of policing of Black men.
Thank you. Erica wants to know, where else have you traveled to study slavery and historical life?
Thank you, Erica. I go everywhere. So my newest project is on slavery in Spain in the 16th century. But I have looked at archives, and I've written about slavery in Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile. So mostly in Latin America, but now I'm branching off into Southern Europe.
Thank you. Okay, so we want to make sure that want to make sure that we wrap up on time here today. Thank you so much for being with us today. For you students who are watching live in this session, we want to make sure, again, to remind you to log on to the community.uoregon.edu site to submit your reflections. And of course, remember, your reflections can be an important thing in this particular case, because Professor McKinley did ask you a question to reflect on early in the program, and it would be fun for us to know how that changed after hearing her presentation. We want to make sure too, for any of you who asked a question that we didn't get to live on camera, we will be doing follow-up early next week with you and making sure that we pass those questions on to Professor McKinley. We want to make sure that you stay on track to complete introduction, not only through community.uoregon.edu, but other ways that you can continue to stay on track and be ready for fall term include uploading your selfie for your UOID card. We will be sending you your ID cards here in August, and we want to make sure that we have those for all of you. Make sure that you're checking your @uoregon.edu email every single day. Keep an eye out for information about room selection, which is coming up quickly. Make sure that you complete your financial aid checklist, and be sure you've set reminders for yourself to have your final transcript sent to the University of Oregon and submit your immunization records to the health center. For links to find out more or to complete these steps, I encourage you to visit our website at orientation.uoregon.edu and clicking on the Next Steps portion of our website. For other questions about this or any other introduction program, you can email us at orientation@uoregon.edu or text us at 541-346-1159. If you'd like to learn more about academic advising at the University of Oregon, please listen to tomorrow's episode of Flock Talk from your favorite podcast platform, or you can listen at flocktalk.uoregon.edu. Thank you again for your time today, and to you, Professor McKinley, thank you for helping our new ducks get ready for fall.
Thank you for having me, and go Ducks.